Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Liz Pavese, and I'm a senior behavioral scientist with CoachHub. I'm really excited to be a part of this conference and to talk with you today about how to cultivate inclusive leadership and scale an inclusive culture. Our journey today will rest around these four objectives. We're first going to talk about and identify what isn't and is working around DEI. We're going to talk about how coaching can really be a part of that strategy to mitigate against some of the things that maybe aren't working so well. We'll then talk about what we really mean by inclusive leadership, and we'll share with you our coaching framework and approach around inclusive leadership. We'll explore a little bit about what the impact of coaching can look like and share a customer story, and then we'll wrap up. Before we dive into the details and sort of the core of this presentation, I wanted to present this question to you and allow you some moments to reflect. What is part of your DEI strategy? I'm sure many of you have a variety of programs, practices, and different policies in place that are meant to tackle different issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging in your workplaces. How many of you are practicing more than half of these things or considering expanding your program to include more of what's on the screen here, which is not an exhaustive list, I understand. How many of you are really leveraging coaching specifically as a key leverage point in your approach to DE&I? At CoachHub, we really believe that coaching in and of itself can have a massive impact in an organization above and beyond the traditional application for leadership development centered around a leadership development program. One of those, I'll call it use cases, is really around issues related to DE&I. So let's talk about those. Let's dive in. Diversity, we know, is a competitive edge. There's been a tremendous amount of academic research, as well as a lot of industry statistics that have come out over the last several decades that point to the competitive edge that diversity gives us in our lives and in our organizations. We know that having more diverse teams leads to greater innovation and creativity. It leads to better decision-making. And we know that from an organizational standpoint, that it increases our ability to have greater profitability. It maximizes shareholder value. And what you can see here from some statistics from McKinsey is that when a company has greater gender diversity, cultural and ethnic diversity, that there's higher profitability. But we know that diversity is only a competitive edge when we leverage it. Diversity does not equal inclusion. And inclusion is when we harness all of that diversity, harnessing all the things that people bring to the table. And in fact, 61% of employees feel pretty negative about the inclusivity in their workplace cultures. So we have a huge opportunity here to really take what progress and the great work that we're doing to have a more diversified workforce, not only from a demographic standpoint, but from a neurodiversity standpoint, from a background and skill standpoint, and really create a place where people feel like they belong, as well as being recognized and embraced for the individual things that they bring. So what are some of the potential barriers in our ability to take that diversity and really create inclusion and have not 61% of employees feeling negative about it? We really need to focus on inclusive leadership, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit later, but it's rare. What a leader says and does makes up about 70% of the difference in an employee saying that they feel included and engaged. That's a huge impact that leaders have. And we know this. We know that managers are a key influencing factor and driver in an employee's experience at work. Yet, we don't have the evidence to show that we have leaders that are really practicing inclusive behaviors regularly and enough of them to really make that difference come to life. So that's one barrier. The second barrier is that we rely a lot on training, which is a great foundational approach for any program, and not to say DE&I is a program, but learning and training is a foundational approach to communicate information, to help disseminate knowledge, to help teach new concepts, to expose people to new ways of thinking, new ways of acting. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with like unconscious bias trainings, conscious inclusion trainings, work around allyship. Those are all great foundational starts, but training itself is not enough. And that's because we're often learning for the wrong reasons. We're putting training in place sometimes for a compliance and check the box activity. We're often learning the wrong things at the wrong time. So the learning that's delivered, that's meant to help teach and expose, or teach a new skill or expose somebody to a new concept, might not be personalized enough and might not be embedded in the context of the work experience and work environment that the learner is experiencing every day. So that transfer of that learning is minimized because of that lack of contextualization. We often forget what we learn. If not implemented within 6 days, 75% of new information is forgotten. But there are ways that we can maximize that transfer and retention of learning if we provide the right enablement mechanisms around that learning experience. DEI trainings don't necessarily solve for supporting that need for belongingness and that need for uniqueness that we have as individuals. Inclusion is both of those things. And so we have to think of other ways to develop the kinds of leadership behaviors and behaviors within ourselves that really enable that feeling of belongingness and feeling of uniqueness to really come to life. And then lastly, much of our training and learning approaches often ignore organizational level factors that drive change. What do I mean by that? A recent meta-analysis that I read showed that unconscious bias trainings have been shown to be much more effective when they are complemented with other organizational interventions and learning opportunities that are tied to the strategic, that are also tied to strategic priorities and put in the context of work. So how do we really overcome these barriers? How do we overcome the strengthening of inclusive leadership so it's more prolific? And how do we build upon the great work and foundation that we have in place with many of our approaches to sort of classical learning and development? Coaching can really be an asset here. Coaching is one of the most effective change management tools. It's 2 times more effective than traditional approaches to facilitating change in organizations, which include classroom learning, e-learning, and working with an exposure to senior leaders. When we're talking about inclusive leadership, we're talking about building behaviors, shifting mindsets, creating a new language and ways of working. And that's really the bedrock of culture, the norms, values, and beliefs and ways of working that are embedded in our organization. And so to really shape a transformation like that, we need an intervention that's good at doing that, good at inculcating or fostering the kinds of behaviors that are going to lead to the kind of change we want to see. And digital coaching is really kind of perfectly made for helping to create inclusive workplaces. Not only because through the coaching experience, we can help develop and grow capabilities within a leader, but the very modality of digital coaching is it inherently embraces diversity, and it can fosters inclusion. So through the process of digital coaching, we're able to create more awareness and help people uncover their own biases, and then identify new and different ways of working that will create and foster an inclusive environment. Through digital coaching and coaching in general, because it is inherently personalized and focused on the individual, it embraces that uniqueness component of what a feeling of inclusivity is all about. Coaching recognizes and accepts all individuals for who they are and what they bring to the table, and helps an individual identify how to leverage those things and build upon them in the context of their whole life and at work. Through that coaching process, as a coachee's perceptions of quality, meaning, purpose, connection, and relationships increase, they start to identify with bigger purposes, with their unique contribution to a larger group or a team or a goal or a whole. And so it fosters that other part of inclusion, which is a sense of belonging. And lastly, digital coaching as a modality allows us to reach more individuals than ever before. It is much more accessible than in the past. We can reach people who were excluded from coaching previously. We can cast a wider net and have a much broader and diverse coaching pool to meet the needs of our employees, whether that's being able to be coached in your native language, whether that's being able to have greater access to coaches with a specific expertise and skill set that maybe was traditionally restricted by location and budget. So digital coaching really seems like this perfect marriage almost for really helping to shift the mindset and create around inclusive behaviors, and helping to enhance inclusivity in our organizational cultures. So we've talked about some of the potential barriers in why that sense of inclusivity is lacking in our workplaces. We talked about how coaching can be a part of that solution in targeting, taking that negative sentiment and hopefully turning it into a positive one over time. So now let's dive into, what do we really mean then by inclusive leadership? What are we developing in our leaders to really bring this inclusive culture to life? Let's start with a formal definition. SHRM is one of the most prolific researchers in the field of inclusion in the workplace and inclusive leadership. And they define inclusive leadership as a set of leader behaviors that are focused on facilitating group members feeling a part of a group, they feel like they belong, and retaining their sense of individuality, their uniqueness, while contributing to group processes and outcomes. So there's a lot that goes into creating this sense of belonging and this sense of uniqueness, and maintaining this sense of uniqueness in an individual, while also managing within the context of work and a team and contributing to greater goals and greater purpose. So let's break down, what are these behaviors that really can make a difference in driving forward a more inclusive culture. At CoachHub, we've developed a DEI coaching framework. And this framework is based on the research that abounds in the literature of inclusive leadership, literature that surrounds inclusion in the workplace, positive psychology, and transformational leadership, as well as some other fields related. What you can see is that there are 6 primary areas in the that make up our model. And they are, the first 2 pieces of the puzzle are how to create a climate of inclusion by fostering a sense of belonging, and the capabilities that are required for embracing one's own uniqueness as well as that of others. The third component of the model is around exemplifying fair and equitable treatment of others and understanding others' experiences of fairness and equity. The fourth element is about focusing on empowering oneself and others. We then have a focus on how do you cultivate one's commitment, your passion and perseverance towards learning and achieving goals, and then therefore being able to unlock that in others. And then the last component, but certainly not least, is around helping oneself and others flourish by developing core psychological mindsets that really activate their experience. Each of these 6 categories, as you can see, is broken down into focus areas. The actual capabilities or competencies that can be developed and that a coach and a coachee can dig deeper in on to understand strengths and areas for opportunity in building their muscles around inclusive behaviors and mindsets. So let's break this down a little bit further. Belonging. Belonging refers to the climate of inclusion. It's about fostering a sense of connection with oneself and with others, and actively forming diverse interpersonal relationships. So here we're focused on capabilities such as connection, about your own sense of agency and your ability to make free choices and act independently. And also the component of psychological safety, the extent to which we're fostering an environment where people feel free and safe to express their opinions and beliefs and ideas, and where those are also embraced. Diving deeper into uniqueness, this is really all about really being able to act in accordance with your own true self, your values, your beliefs, encouraging and embracing and celebrating everyone else's unique self, as well as their strengths and differences. So how do we bring awareness to those things? How do we appreciate those things? And how do we act in accordance with our values? Fairness is all about fostering equity in an organization. How do we being able to treat others justly by being curious, wanting to learn more about yourself and about others, understanding other people's experiences, being empathetic, and seeking to really understand someone's experience from their own frame of reference. And then to really be able to bring all that knowledge, that empathy, that curiosity about others to your thinking and decision-making processes. How does that perspective help us think more holistically from multiple angles and help us determine what the right next course of action is? Empowerment is really all about sort of psychological capital. It's the idea that we are developable, really. Empowerment really here centers on helping us to really understand our own levels of self-esteem, the amount of confidence we bring to something, how we are able to challenge and motivate ourselves to think differently and creatively and foster that in others. And then really fostering an environment where communication is open and transparent and pushes for dialogue and debate, and difficult and hard conversations can be held. Commitment. This is around developing capabilities for the passion and perseverance towards learning and achieving goals, right? Setting and achieving long-term goals and figuring out a way to get there, even when it gets difficult. And this is where grit, that perseverance, comes into play. Having a learning mindset and a growth mindset, believing that you're changeable and developable, comes into play. And the last is flourish. And as we dive into flourishing, this is really all about really building upon one's belief in one's own capabilities, being able to cultivate a mindset of opportunities and create new pathways and ways of thinking that inspire more intrinsic motivation for the future. And then it also focuses in on resilience, building upon that idea of grit, of persevering and tackling and going after the goals that you want. But when you have a setback, how easily can you bounce back from that, learn, and continue forward? Combined, this is what creates our framework for inclusive leadership, and what we think is going to be incredibly powerful in really inspiring your leaders, your teams, and yourselves in bringing your own uniqueness to work, embracing uniqueness in others, and being able to create a community and sense of belonging for your organizations to thrive. So what impact does digital coaching have? And can this, when we apply this model of inclusive behaviors to our organizations, what are we seeing? So let's take a look. First, we have to think about how we set up and look at your program. How are we going to launch, coaching in your organization? Before you can figure out how you look at the impact, we have to figure out what impact we're looking for and what's the right modality to get us there. So I wanted to paint a little bit of a sample picture of what a sort of coaching approach could look like in your companies. Really, it's about ensuring that you have proper onboarding. In many cases, we might have a blended approach in terms of one-on-one coaching and group coaching. So we're capitalizing on not only individual learning, but peer learning, as well as complementing that with bite-sized learning along the way. So that way, coaching can build off of what's being learned from a kind of e-learning or e-learning approach, but that the e-learning can also complement some new insights and practices that are being identified in the coaching process. And then we would get to evaluation of impact. So with this in mind, right, this is one sample program. Here are some different things that we might anticipate seeing from the application of coaching in your workplaces. We have seen in our data here at CoachHub that coaching is absolutely having an impact. We know this also from academic research, but digital coaching is also having an impact. We're seeing our coachees, the employees in our customer organizations, are seeing their own behaviors change. They're identifying some new perspectives and new insights for themselves. And they're building their self-reflection and self-awareness. So this is kind of overall. But what about those inclusive behaviors that we talked about? What are we starting to see in the data there? This is just a quick snapshot, some quick data that I pulled together to showcase what we're seeing in communication, resilience, goal setting, and a growth mentality, that growth mindset. So these are 4 of of the many capabilities that we just talked about. But what you can see here, this data was pulled in September. And so from January through September, coaches in their respective programs that are working on capabilities that are related to inclusive leadership behaviors have the opportunity to rate how much progress they're making in these different areas. And in our data set, we see that more than 50% of males and females are reporting progress in these areas. So when coaching has a focus on communication, resilience, goal setting, growth mentality, or growth mindset, it is making a difference in how people see their skills developing. It can grow inclusive behaviors. It can be a facilitator in growing inclusive behaviors. So let's really see what's going on, in a real practical sense. I want to share a customer story which centers on a particular customer of ours that has a women in leadership program. The European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, they are active in 38 countries. They're a financial institution, and they have identified in their own workforce the kind of gap that they're seeing in leadership, particularly the representation of women, which is not an uncommon challenge. Many organizations are challenged with this. They specifically implemented a women in leadership development program. And it's about really developing women from all levels of their career to fuel their talent development, even starting from an earlier stage of career. They really were looking for a partner to take a strengths-based approach with coaching. Coaching was not a part of their development program when they started it, because they really saw an opportunity to build confidence, reinforce learning from the program itself, and start to really focus in on not only providing coaching from a population of people that may not have accessed coaching before, but also reinforce foundational leadership behaviors as well as inclusive leadership behaviors. So what are we seeing in terms of some of the impact that this program is having? When we worked with the EBRD to implement coaching alongside this Women in Leadership program, we started to see the following results. 86% of the participants in this program said that they were not only identifying strengths and weaknesses, but more than 86% really felt strength in that coach-and-coachee relationship, which is really, really important when we think about what impact coaching can have. Without that coaching relationship and strength in that, it's less likely that we would see the high rate of being able to identify strengths and weaknesses and feel confident in the learning of new skills and capabilities that's taking place. That trust and that bond that's happening is helping to fuel some of the other outcomes that are associated with what EBRD is starting to see. We see that 74% of the individuals said that coaching is really helping to achieve their goals. And one of the things that I really loved hearing from EBRD is from one of the coachees, a success story. So following the first iteration of this program was a promotion cycle. And one of the individuals said, if it were not for this program, I would not have spoken out in my interview during the promotion cycle about the things that I have done and been clear about my contribution. And within 3 months of that program completing, that woman was promoted. for the position she applied for. So here's a really great example of an organization being able to provide a solution that naturally embraces diversity and can foster inclusion, digital coaching, making it accessible to a population of people who were not necessarily prioritized for coaching previously, because now it's more affordable, more scalable, and is able to strengthen a diversity, equity, and inclusion program by coupling it with coaching and helping to develop the self-esteem, self-efficacy, resiliency that are all core components of behaviors that are required not only for the success in leadership for these women, but will also help contribute to creating that inclusive culture and environment that EBRD is really striving for. So as we wrap up from today, we talked a lot about diversity, some of the barriers in getting inclusion from that diversity, how coaching can be a powerful tool in creating that inclusivity. We identified what inclusive leadership behaviors are, how through coaching those can be developed. We talked about some of the potential impact that you might see by incorporating coaching into your programs and into your strategies for tackling DEI. So what can you do next? First, I would recommend, and you were already doing this, I'm sure, is consistently reviewing your DEIB plans and priorities. Evaluate what's working, what's not working. And be bold. Think creatively about how you can take coaching to impact various aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We don't have to stay tied to the things that don't work because it's just what we've done. We have such an opportunity to bring more personalized, more accessible, and more relevant learning and development opportunities to more people than ever before. Continue to create space and talk about DEIB in concrete ways. I think oftentimes, and why I wanted to spend some time on defining what inclusive leadership is and talking about that inclusion is about belonging and uniqueness, is because we often aren't really clear on the terms that we're using in our companies. And so let's use language. And when we talk about inclusive leadership, let's talk about the behaviors and what that means. And then I offer you to reflect on what one thing you can do differently to enhance your focus on inclusivity. What commitment can you make to yourself? What commitment can you make to a colleague or coworker or your team? I want to thank you for tuning in to this session. If you are attending, virtually, please don't miss our virtual booth to learn more and connect with us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.